Hello, and welcome back to Mass Media and American Politics. As you know, I'm your instructor, Daniel Kirsch, and today we're going to be talking about Module 4, Chapter 7, and I think this is going to be a fairly short video, but one thing that I want to not emphasize, but explain first is that the video quality might look a little different than it usually does. That's probably because of the lighting and I'm recording at night, and because of some technical difficulties, and just wanted to make sure that you understand that normally the quality is much better, and this is just going to be one of the worst ones. But that's just the way things roll sometimes, and I think you should still be able to see the board. But anyway, I'm going to be running through what pretty much all these things mean anyway. So to start off with, just to give you an idea of what this chapter is all about, it's an extension really of what the module is about, which is about primarily campaign effects and the role that campaigns play in the media and that the media play in campaigns. And in the last chapter, the last lecture video that I gave to you, which I would urge you to watch first before this one, we talked quite a bit about the historical presidential campaigns that have been really central in shaping the media's narrative, as well as the kind of dominant political science paradigm of just how campaigns work and how presidential candidates themselves have really functioned within the kind of media dynamic that we currently have. And I wanted to spend a little time before we got started too deeply talking about why we talk about presidential campaigns. And this is not necessarily something that Iyengar talks about. But the reason that Iyengar, and I don't think he talks about it or really examines it himself, but it is an extension of something that he discusses. Namely that there is an ongoing debate about how much, if at all, campaigns matter to the outcome of elections. And that seems like a pretty radical thing to say, but it's actually a very common and even the majority opinion within modern political science, and I'll explain why in a minute. But the reason why is the reason why we study presidential campaigns, number one, is, who was it who said that famous, I think that was a famous bank robber who said, why do you rob banks? And I'm sure someone will correct me, or I'll look it up right after I'm done with this, but why do you rob banks? And the person said, because that's where the money is. I think that's kind of why political scientists study presidential elections, and why when we talk about campaigns, we talk about presidential candidates. So that's part of the reason. The other part of the reason is simply because there are things that exist at the national level that don't really exist consistently at the local level or even the state level. And one of those things is that the parties are really at par nationally. There's about equal strength, and has been in the entire modern era, between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And of course they've gone back and forth in terms of victory in presidential elections. And they've also, there's been relative landslides in presidential elections, and even relative landslides in Congress in terms of the size of the victory. But there's not been even one election that has truly, obliterated the other party as the opposition, or even as an effective opposition. So, even when the Republicans lost by such a scale after Watergate that they were relegated to less than a third of members of the House, they were still able to field a presidential candidate in 1976 who almost won. And then 4 years later, they fielded a candidate who did win, Ronald Reagan. So it's that's the Republican version, and there's Democratic versions too. So the parties really are at par, and that's not true at really any local level. There are Democratic and Republican parties in most localities, in all localities. Let me be clear. Um, but there's such an enrollment advantage in many communities, and certainly in congressional elections, there's a manufactured enrollment advantage, for which is another topic, uh, in almost every congressional district. So it's so kind of all over the place everywhere else that there's no way to bring a consistency to the study of do campaigns matter, because uh, what you're really measuring, you're not able to control in an experiment the same way you are in at the presidential level. Excuse me. So what I'm saying is that in a natural experiment or in any experiment, what you want to do is hold everything constant, all other potential variables constant, so that you can see if the one variable that does change, it has the effect that you expect it to have. And so with the parties, you're not varying their level of control or their level of enrollment advantage or financial advantage or anything, because they're basically at par. And certainly over the long run and over the last 40 years, they've been relatively at par if you total their presidential election victories as well as their just average enrollment and all kinds of other ways you can average it out. They're about the same. So if that's true, and if the parties are about the same, then you're not starting out either one at an unfair advantage. And so you can really see if campaigns themselves or the other potential variable are really the reasons why we end up having one party win and one party lose. And so with campaigns, it doesn't do everything that the media tells us they do. And namely, and to kind of cut to the end, namely, they don't change people's minds, which is really not what you expect of campaigns. The idea of a campaign, is borrowed in large part from, a full-scale media campaign, like an ad campaign, like you might have seen in the show Mad Men, where a campaign is they launch a campaign that has a new slogan and they try to sell you a new product. Only this new product is voting for a particular candidate. But instead, rather political scientists, and rather counterintuitively, I guess, if you were to talk to anybody about what do you think a political scientist thinks about campaigns, and do they love campaigns, do they study campaigns? Most political scientists who study presidential elections and statistically have gone about creating a mathematical model about the most reliable predictions of presidential elections have instead landed on this idea that rather definitively that it's a combination of primarily economic factors that allow for one candidate to win and the other candidate to lose, and more precisely, one party's candidate to win and another party's candidate to lose. And the argument goes like this. To quote again, as I did in the last lecture, Ronald Reagan from 1980, he asked the question directly to the camera, to the American people in 1980, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? So he made the kind of implicit question, again, explicit. He brought it out into the open. And that's essentially what political scientists think about why people vote the way that they do. That's really part one of it, the economic part of it. And that's the reason why if there's a recession, for example, in the year before, and it's a massive recession, then you would expect, and anyone would expect, that the current president, if they're blamed for that recession, is not going to be granted re-election if they're running for re-election that year. Instead, you would expect the other major party's candidate to win. So think about Herbert Hoover, right? So Herbert Hoover was president during the Great Depression, and he hadn't always been. He started out his presidency, he was in 1929, he was considered a really young leader who was very into charitable work. And he was a businessman, but he'd also been in the cabinet. And so he was seen as continuing the successful economic policies of the Roaring Twenties. But then in 1929, when the stock market crashed, and over the next 2 years, as the Great Depression developed, more and more people were out of work. And Hoover didn't see a role for government to intervene in the economy. And so, people started blaming him for the recession by naming the new homeless tent cities that sprang up around the U.S. Hoovervilles. So in an atmosphere like that, you can understand why the Democrats, when they nominate someone like Franklin Roosevelt, governor of New York, someone who promised a New Deal for the American people, you can understand why just intuitively again why that party would win, promising some hope in a hopeless situation when the president was not himself promising that same hope. So that's an extreme example, though, but if at the minute level, if there's a recession, even then, that's enough often to kind of catapult the other party, which is only marginally weaker than the incumbent party in the White House. You would expect that the out party during a recession year is going to win because people are trying to throw out the people they're blaming for the recession. And that's the really basic boiled down argument. But there's a lot of variations on that same argument, and I don't have time and probably not even the expertise to go through all of those different models. But you should know that at the beginning of your chapter, maybe in the third or fourth page, there's a chart that shows all these different names, and all the names are names of famous political scientists who have created these models, and the number next to their name is the number of points off they were in the 2016 presidential election in terms of predicting the accuracy of their predicted outcome. And I think only one was at 0.0, another one was at 1.0. The rest were within 4 points or so, and so that's pretty good. But in a world where typically the margin of victory is somewhere less than 5 percentage points and has been for the last several presidential elections, it's not terribly useful. Even if it is good, it's not terribly useful. So anyway, so the economic model is really what is the predominant one. But what's interesting about this chapter is that it's written by someone who's actually done some really important work in this area. And the really important work that Iyengar has done is he and his writing partner Stephen and Solbacher they partnered to do some actual experiments, not just natural experiments. They paid some people and had them sit in front of a TV, and they had them watch a newscast. And before they watched the newscast, they asked them, "Do you intend to vote for this year's nominee from your party?" And they'd already asked them what party they were, and they interviewed a lot of Democrats and Republicans. And the person might have said yes, and they might have said no. But then they had them watch a newscast. It was a made-up newscast, and they also put in a commercial about that was favorable towards the candidate from their party. And after the newscasts, they asked them the same question. Are you planning? What do you think? Are you planning to vote for, the nominee of this party? And it turned out that the people who identified with the candidate of that party were 3 times more likely to go and vote for that. I think I'm characterizing this right. The 3 times more likely to vote for the candidate of that party than to vote for than the people who were members of the other party, as well as independents. So existing partisans, are much more activated or primed or educated towards voting for the candidate of their own party than people in the out party or people in the independent group are convinced at all to vote for people of that party. So in fact, political campaigns are, I made up my own term here, loyalty strengtheners. Okay, they're exercises in simply trying to get people to vote in the interest they've already identified as their ongoing kind of partisan interest. And part of what is so interesting about this is that in an age where we're all coming to understand, from political science like this, and from, the existing kind of strategies that the parties really are using, that mobilizing your base is more important than persuasion, than trying to change minds. That's what's interesting about that, is that when you combine it with the next thing that I'm going to tell you, it really makes for a very dull and very unproductive political debate, and maybe even explains a little bit why the last presidential debate degenerated so quickly. And obviously it has a lot to do with the personality of President Trump and the fact that he was, talking over everyone. So he takes I think a fair degree of credit for that particular moment. But I guess what I'm saying is that debates have never been debates. And I think I mentioned this in the last video. Debates are not, you don't get an award for best debater, and you don't win on the basis of points. You win by winning the election. And in a debate, I guess the fiction that we've all been telling ourselves for the last 40 or so years is that in a debate, people are watching to make up their mind. And that's partially true, I think. But based on this information, they're not making their mind whether or not to vote for one candidate or the other, or at least 95% of people aren't. It's more like people are deciding whether to go out and vote or not. And they're deciding whether or not they care enough to vote. And for the most part, campaigns are successful in mobilizing their existing voter bases, but sometimes they're not successful. And I would argue that probably in 1996, you could say that Democrats really were not successful. Or Republicans maybe weren't, neither party was. Only about 48 or 49% of people voted. And maybe that was because they weren't mobilized. And, we only have 60% in a good year, but 49% is still pretty low. But I think could also explain that away because it was a really good economy and no one really felt motivated to go vote. Or at least fewer people were motivated. So combine that with the next thing I'm going to tell you. The next thing I'm going to tell you is that Iyengar also makes the point that most voters are low information voters. And what that means is that, few people are as obsessed as the media and political scientists about politics. The media, professional politicians, amateur politicians, political scientists, and the kind of pundit class. All of those people are interested in politics and they want to talk about it all the time. And not everybody's like that, I think it was a relative of mine who said something like, no, we'll talk about anything you want except religion or politics. Well, I'm a political scientist and I've engaged in a lot of politics and I'm married to a minister, so doesn't seem like we're going to have a lot of conversation. But low information voters seem to be the majority, and Iyengar makes the point that because they pay so little attention, because most people pay so little attention, most people also have made kind of lifelong decisions, number one, that they are partisan or leaning partisan in a certain way, and I'll come back to that statistic. But also that they don't really care who the candidate is because they place so much stock in the fact that they belong to this party or the other. And this really is true, that most people belong to one party or the other, that they don't have time to decide who they're going to vote for, but there's so much media attention around all the people who are running for office that it's just simply an extension of the general election campaign is the primary campaign, a reverse extension. It goes into the kind of year before and years before the next presidential election. So you can almost say that presidential election season is like 2 years every 4 years. It's kind of exhausting. But for most people, they don't pay attention until maybe the new year of the presidential election year. And at that point, when the news cycle really begins to pick up coverage about Iowa and New Hampshire, the first two presidential nominating contests, there's a very short window between then and when the nomination is virtually decided. They might have 2 months, maybe. And during that 2 months, if low information voters are not ever going to pay attention, they just aren't. But if they do pay attention, the overarching argument for the strength of someone's campaign is simply viability in the general election. And that just means ability to win the general election. And, so that doesn't leave a lot of room for personality debate. And so, it leaves a lot of room for personality debate. It doesn't leave a lot of room for policy debate. And so, not only the time is compressed, but people don't pay attention. And in addition to that, most candidates will try to just introduce themselves and offend the fewest people and lean heavily on their biography. So if you can think of the last few major presidential candidates, if you've paid attention at all, if you've read the news or heard the news, and you have a vague memory of Hillary Clinton or even maybe Mitt Romney and Barack Obama and Donald Trump and Joe Biden and maybe even Bernie Sanders, what could you tell me about them? What could you tell me about their central policy platforms or their record? And furthermore, how much they do or don't deviate from the Democratic or Republican Party norm. Could you say any of that? If you can, bravo, good for you. Maybe you're really interested. But if you can't, that's totally normal. Because the media attention is so focused on their personalities and their biographies that's what people want to read about, because it's all people care about, because they've already made their decision about whether they're a Democrat or Republican or an independent. And the only question is, are they going to go vote? And these campaigns, largely through a lot of evidence, Iyengar shows this pretty convincingly, that from March of an election year until October of an election year, those, it's like 7 months. That 7-month period is basically a loyalty enhancement and voter education period where you're supposed to be inspiring your base to vote for you, to actually get up out of bed, right, and vote for you. So he shows this, I think, again, pretty convincingly. And one of the pieces of evidence that I already knew, to be honest, but that many people find surprising, sometimes I mention it in my intro courses, is that most people are really about 90% of people, maybe a little more, 92% of people, identify in one way or another as a Democrat or as a Republican. And it's not right away. You sort of have to scratch the surface a little bit. There's the gold standard of opinion survey research in political science, and that's through the University of Michigan data, and that's been in existence since the 1940s. But today, that that survey data tells us that over time, not much has changed, except perhaps for the South and the alignment of Democrats there. But for the most part, it's pretty stable. It looks like this. It's goes the spectrum from you could be one of 7 identities essentially: strong Democrat, weak Democrat, independent Democrat, independent independent, independent Republican, weak Republican, strong Republican. So everyone who answers the survey, I think except maybe 1 or 2% typically just say don't know, but 98, 99% of people vote in one of those ways. And only the independents are pure independents, right? And the independents who lean Democrat or lean Republican, those are the people you have to convince to come out and vote. So they might not vote for every Democratic nominee if they've typically voted Democrat in the past. They might feel like they need to be wooed. They need to be persuaded that it'll do any good at all to vote for this Democrat. So who knows if that's well, I was gonna say who knows if that's true. No, it's true. That's essentially how it works. And so if you combine all of that information with who the base is to be, that Democrats rely predominantly on not predominantly but largely, they rely on African American votes. African Americans are 12% of the U.S. population, have been really since the Civil War, and they vote typically 90% for Democrats in not only presidential elections but most elections, and so that's an enormous building block for a coalition, and you can afford to kind of lose out on a lot of other parts of a potential majority coalition. But you want to make sure that that base is mobilized. You want to make sure that group of people is motivated to go out and vote for you. But you also need to build on that. And one of the building blocks they've struggled to build on is young people. And young people have always voted pretty strongly for Democrats since the 1970s, when 18-year-olds were given the right to vote. But, as Iyengar notes, and I often talk about in my lectures, and I also mention in my book, you should go read my book. It's about student loans. Why do we make it so difficult for young people to vote when we know it's the stage of life where it already is? It would be the hardest to vote if you made it the easiest thing in the world. But you don't make it the easiest thing in the world. You have to re-register every time you move at a time of life when most people don't have a permanent address. And